Welcome back one more time, all you lovely people. Let's finish up this module on the deliberative utilitarianism of John Stuart Mill. Bum, bum, bum. And now, as I've noted already, as we can see, I'll just put it up there again. There's a lot going on in Mill's deliberative utilitarianism, lots of different things. And of course, the crucial part, this is where, he diverges from Jeremy Bentham in classical utilitarianism, is this idea of eudaimonism. Recall that eudaimonism says that well-being is nothing other than happiness, understood as the pleasure that comes from the cultivation and exercise of those higher order capacities, distinguishing human beings from other animals. And in the last video, I mentioned there is this issue that every student I've ever had will always ask at some point. I'll try my best to answer it, but they always say, how can anyone really say what's a higher pleasure versus a lower pleasure? And indeed, I think that's absolutely the right question to ask, because Mill has set himself a little problem that he needs to solve. He needs to figure this out, because look, it's pretty clear that people disagree all the time about what counts as a higher valuable pleasure versus what counts as a lower less valuable pleasure. I mean, maybe if we start thinking in terms of higher, lower faculties, that can help a little bit, but people still, excuse me, I just had had another snack. Dang it, it's not even, I can't edit it. Oh, well, you're welcome. So people clearly disagree, but making it worse is that pleasure is a subjective thing, because look, pleasure happens in the mind. That's unavoidable. Mill has to kind of accept that he is still talking about a mental state of a kind. Definitely a complex mental state compared to Bentham, which is distinguishing higher and lower faculties. Fine, but it's still something subjective, because it's something that occurs in the mind. This is not, it's just subjective. So, but Mill kind of wants there to be a more objective judgment about what's a good pleasure versus what is a lesser pleasure. What counts as a good pleasure, what counts as a less good pleasure. And Mill's going to resolve this with what he didn't call it this, but people today tend to call it the test of the cognoscenti. I love that word, cognoscenti. The test of the cognoscenti asks us to ask how competent judges evaluate these different sorts of pleasure. So yes, let these competent judges evaluate the different kinds of pleasure, and they will be able to advise us which ones are the higher ones versus which ones are the lower ones. Or of course, maybe they're the same kind of pleasure. They could be equally good. We see this idea appear on page 187. We see John Stuart Mill presents this idea. So yeah, on 187, he says, of two pleasures, if there be one which all or who have experience of both give a decided preference, that is the more desirable pleasure. And then let's just keep going a little forward. So just jump now. Where are we? Jump to 189. Jump to page 189, where Mill goes on to say, from this verdict of the only competent judges, I apprehend there can be no appeal on a question which is the best worth having of two pleasures, or which of two modes of existence is the most grateful to the feelings. The judgment of those who are qualified by knowledge of both, or if they differ, that of the majority among them must be admitted as final. So we're talking about Mill saying we need to get competent judges who will experience both, that he thinks that's really the best we can do. Someone has to experience these pleasures because they are subjective. So someone or a group, the cognoscenti as I'm calling them, have to experience them both. And so what makes someone a competent judge? You can read the passage, I'll kind of give the highlights. These judges, to be competent, have to be well-informed or competently acquainted with different sorts of pleasure. I mean, you can't ask a child the value of poetry, say, compared to the value of cake for dinner. You ask a child, what do you want for dinner? They're always going to say cake. Yeah. So you say, hey, child, which is better, this poetry I'm about to read you or cake for dinner? Well, we all know a child's going to be like, take the poetry. Yeah, a very sophisticated child will be like, excuse me, sir, you can keep the poetry. I'll take the cake for dinner. Yeah, of course, the child wants cake. But of course, that's because the child hasn't experienced the pleasure of poetry. The child has no point of comparison of poetry and cake. So of course they're going to like cake. So instead, a competent judge knows both kinds of pleasure, understands why each, because look, I would consider myself at least a judge of cake for dinner, and it is pretty tasty. But there are other pleasures I think that are more valuable. So I, Professor Gray, am a competent judge. And I'm sure the English majors in the class are competent judges of poetry and can compare that to cake for dinner and tell us. And I hope you English majors would prefer poetry. Maybe I'm underestimating the cake here. But anyway, we need the judge who understands how, these different kinds of pleasure they're acquainted with, they've experienced. What do they say is the one that's more valuable, the higher pleasure? And in addition to being acquainted, the competent judge must be equally susceptible to both classes of pleasure, says John Stuart Mill. That is, if a person is just for whatever reason, there are people like that. I think I'm actually one. I get very little pleasure from poetry. I've tried. I've just not able to develop that part of my mind. I'm good at other stuff, but poetry I could just never do. I just really struggled in English class in high school. Whereas I can really enjoy action movies, though. But again, if we're comparing poetry to action movies, we have to ask someone who gets pleasure from both. So we need a judge who can watch an action movie and be like, oh, yeah, this is good. I like this. And a person who can appreciate the pleasures of poetry. And then we say again, which one is better? They can give us the relative merits. We don't ask someone like me, I'll go for the action movie because I am not equipped. It's just who I am. And I feel embarrassed and sad, but poetry has always struggled with. It took me a long time before I could appreciate literature, and I'm still growing there. See, we're all progressive beings. Even us old folks, we can learn and grow as well. Anyway, in laying all this out about these competent judges, what Mill is trying to show is why we can rely on experts, because experts are still giving us their subjective judgments. They're subjective because they have to experience the pleasure and then tell us which one's better. And I think there is an analogy here, another thing that I'm not good at, so I'm useless. But it's like if you talk about like wine experts, a wine expert can drink different kinds of wine and tease out the differences between these wines and then which one's better. And they make a lot of money doing this. So clearly we're willing to, because drinking wine is subjective, but we're willing to trust that there is such a thing as a wine expert who can give us an informed, competent judgment of these two, wine A, wine B, drink, subjective, pleasure, yay. But the expert can tell us, the pleasure from this wine is better. And the rest of us are like, okay, I'll trust you. Is the bottle, how expensive is it? That's how I judge wine. How expensive is it? And do I like the label? My wife is a much better wine snob than me. But it's the same thing when it comes to the higher and lower pleasures. We need just people that we can trust who have experience with different kinds of pleasure to tell us, or at least advise us on which one's the higher versus the lower. Because again, pleasure is in the mind. There's no getting around that. Mill has to accept that fact. We are talking about things in the mind. We're not dealing with facts like physics in the external world that we can observe. No, we're dealing with things that are going on in a person's mind. Again, it's pleasure. But so that's unavoidably subjective. It's a subjective experience of pleasure. So we do need to have judges who have the ability to appreciate all different kinds of pleasure. And again, go back to like wine. To become a wine expert requires a lot of drinking of wine, they take classes, they do all sorts of stuff. I have friends who've done this. My wife loves it. I don't understand. But maybe I could do it with beer. I can become a beer expert maybe. But either way, whatever. To become an expert on matters of taste requires lots of training and skill. And Mill's just saying, look, but this is how it's going to work even with these moral issues of higher capacities, lower capacities, etc. And so again, he's just trying to say is that we need people who have these competent judges need that kind of training in different kinds of pleasure so that we can at least trust that they're reliable and that they're accurate. And of course, Mill does believe that these competent judges will again and again be preferring pleasures that come from our capacity of heart and mind as humans and giving relatively less importance to the pleasures that are purely lower pleasures. He does think that the cognoscenti, the judges, will agree with him. So that's how Mill tries to resolve this puzzle about higher and lower pleasures. Yes, pleasure is subjective. Yes, people will disagree about what counts as a higher versus a lower pleasure, but we can really reduce that disagreement by focusing on these cognoscenti, these competent judges who have experience with all sorts of pleasure. And so we can trust them to resolve our confusions about what's higher and lower. And then Mill will say, look, at the very least, we'll get a good general sense that the higher faculties, those pleasures that we're getting from them, that's what matters. And let me tell you what, you're about to experience a lower pleasure of, oh, I'm done with this module. I mean, that's Mill's idea. I love Mill. He's talking about plans and projects and that massive satisfaction we feel when we've accomplished an intellectual project, finishing a bloody module for a class. That is like, that's a pleasure, and I hope you get it. I get the pleasure when I'm done. I hope you're getting pleasure when you're done. Well, maybe after you take the module quiz. So yeah, another module out of the way. John Stuart Mill is sort of a big deal, to say the least. So be very proud of yourself. You have accomplished something yet again, going through one of the greatest ever thinkers who did, ethics and morality. Yeah, so well done. Let's get rid of some arm flab. Oh yeah, that's a lower pleasure, but it's a good lower pleasure. And you'll look nice. Pat yourself on the back. Well done. Just finish up the module quiz, maybe do some, the usual tweeting. And hey, I'll be here enjoying my higher pleasures, maybe some Cheetos to get the lower and, a nice balance between the higher and lower. You know where to find me. And, well, hey, in the meantime, you guys always know what to do now. You take care. You stay safe.